Dawson's Field, Jordan, 1970, a final gesture to fix the cause of Palestinian liberation in the eyes of the world, an image so important to the hijackers that they warned the cameraman to wait for it. 20 years on, the association of that cause with terrorism still impedes every attempt at a peaceful solution. It was just one instance in a cycle of violence that in the last 20 years has become increasingly random, creating a climate of fear throughout much of the world. The security forces are rarely able to predict the source or direction of the next attack, and as terrorists become more sophisticated, opportunities for successful intervention occur only rarely. For much of its history, those resorting to terrorism fell into two main categories: groups ostensibly fighting for a nationalist or separatist cause, like the Provisional IRA and ETA in Spain, among many others. And the left-wing or anarchist groups hoping to provoke a revolution, like the Red Brigade and the Baader-Meinhof gang. Tactically, they have all learnt from each other, through direct contact or by example. The IRA's car bomb was readily adopted into the Middle East, and faced with stronger defences, it evolved into the suicide bomb. Encountering a similar problem, the IRA introduced proxy bombing, forcing men to become suicide bombers while their families are held hostage. Just as the tactics have evolved, so too has the nature of terrorism. During the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, the world watched a superpower held to ransom. The threat to the lives of its citizens left America powerless. Its failed rescue attempt only added to its humiliation, exacerbating the plight of the hostages. The events of those 444 days in Iran highlighted a third mutation of terrorism. Countries have adopted the tactics of the terrorist. State-sponsored terrorism is the latest evolution of a phenomenon that has its roots in post-war Palestine. Israel is a country preoccupied with terrorism, its people constantly on guard against attacks from within and without. Terrorism here is even older than the state itself, and the first examples of it were not Arab but Jewish. In 1946, the King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British-mandated government of Palestine. A bomb planted by a Jewish terrorist group, the Irgun Zavai Leumi, killed 88 people. The Irgun member who planned the attack was Menachem Begin, later Prime Minister of Israel. Another member wanted by the British police was Yitzhak Yezhenitsky, now Yitzhak Shamir, the present Prime Minister. It was part of a campaign to drive the British out of Palestine. And it worked. In the wake of the Nazi Holocaust, the creation of a Jewish homeland had strong backing, and the UN decided on partition. In the Arab-Israeli war that followed, the Irgun and Stern gangs conducted a campaign of terror to drive out the Arab population. A massacre at Deir Yassin accelerated the flight of the Arabs. 700,000 Palestinians left their lands for refugee camps in the West Banks and neighboring countries. The long and bloody exile of the Palestinians had begun. When Yasser Arafat attended the United Nations in 1974 as the leader of the PLO, he came with an olive branch and a gun, asking the world not to let the olive branch slip from his hand. Yet while he may have held the olive branch, his was not the only gun among the Palestinians. For the PLO is an umbrella organization within which a number of different groups operate. Each of them have different political programs and their own links to different Arab states. Many extreme acts of terrorism have been committed to protect their individual interests. Of the 8 groups, 4 are particularly active. Arafat's own group, Fatah, makes up the largest military force within the PLO and follows his moderate line. It distinguished itself early on in military confrontations with the Israelis. It was not above terrorist acts. It was a Fatah splinter group, Black September, which massacred 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. When German marksmen sprang a trap at the airport, 3 terrorists survived, throwing grenades into the helicopter holding the hostages. Freed by another hijack, they appeared in Libya to explain their action.
What do you think you achieved? هذا اعتقادكم أو تفكيركم أنتم أيوة حضرة السادة. The same thinking. They have made their voice heard by the universe or the world who has not been hearing before.
The PFLP were the first group to start hijacking in the Middle East. Dawson's Field, their most spectacular action, was designed to sabotage negotiations with Israel. Broadening the conflict to include Western countries was a natural step for a Marxist group believing in world revolution. The massacre at Lod Airport, carried out on their behalf by a Japanese suicide squad, revealed their part in an international terror network.
These Japanese revolutionaries that took part in this operation are comrades, PFLP comrades. They were members previously of the Revolutionary Red Army in Japan, and they believed in international revolution, and they came to take part in our struggle here, since the struggle is the same, whether in Vietnam or in Japan or here in Palestine.
In a kamikaze-style attack in 1987, 2 PFLP members flew hand gliders from Lebanon into Israel. One got through to an army camp. Before he was shot, he killed 6 Israeli soldiers. The PFLP's leader, George Habash, also founded the Rejection Front, which for years refused to recognize Israel and wanted to continue the fight.
This is our job, to return to strike Israeli targets in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Palestine.
The DFLP, now led by Naif Hawatmeh, was considered moderate until in May 1974, 3 guerrillas seized a school in Ma'alot, holding the children hostage. It turned into a massacre as they shot it out with the Israelis. 20 teenagers died in one of the worst attacks within Israel. The procession of coffins only fueled Israeli fury. Moshe Dayan made their policy clear.
If we cannot live at peace on our side, then eventually the entire southern part of Lebanon won't be able to live there.
The Israelis hit back. Retaliatory raids into the Lebanon by land and air became part of life for the next generation of Palestinians growing up accustomed to war. The PFLP General Command broke away because they wanted less talk and more action. In underground bases in the Lebanon, they trained for suicide raids into Israel in the early 70s, again intent on disrupting any negotiations. Their faces hidden from outsiders, they were given suicide kits lined with explosives in case of capture in Israel. They went further afield too. In 1973, during a hijack at Rome Airport, they threw phosphor bombs into a passenger plane, killing 32 people. The General Command is supplied and funded by both Libya and Syria. They also backed its leader, Ahmed Jabril, in his war against Arafat in 1983. The Palestine Liberation Front, led by Abu Abbas, split from the General Command, preferring Iraqi backing. Its hijacking of the Italian liner Achille Lauro in 1985 destroyed yet another peace plan. That the group was not known for terrorism perhaps explains how the terrorists allowed themselves to be discovered cleaning their Kalashnikovs. What was intended as a suicide raid into Israel turned into a sea-jacking, a murder, and an international incident. In 1988, the leaders of the main groups finally agreed on a program that allowed Arafat some credibility when he returned to the UN 14 years after his first visit to say,
I hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
There are still other Palestinian groups outside the PLO who are not bound by his words, and of them all, the man on the left is the most dangerous, for this is Abu Nidal. The most infamous of all Palestinian terrorists, Mohammed Sabri al-Banna, was born in Jaffa in 1941. While studying as an engineer in Cairo, he met Yasser Arafat and joined Fatah. He was Fatah's representative in Baghdad until in 1973 he fell out with Arafat and founded the Fatah Revolutionary Council. He started by murdering PLO moderates like Issam Satawi, aiming to frustrate any negotiation with Israel. After this, Arafat put a price on his head. He has worked from 4 countries and has grown rich, killing for his patrons, with investments in the arms and drugs trade. He is described by many as a psychopath. In Tripoli, he reportedly buried a disloyal aide in his backyard and built a patio over him. His 500 dedicated followers undergo intensive training in all types of combat. Working in small cells, they have hit targets throughout Europe and the Middle East. Survivors of their actions have testified to the blend of professionalism and sheer ruthlessness that distinguishes their work.
The chief, he was killing the girls and ladies just easy as he drinks a cup of coffee. He was crazy, I think. He wasn't normal. He was abnormal because he was killing them. He came again in the cockpit. He was whistling, eating, singing. No problem at all.
They look like businessmen, really well dressed.
In December 1985, after breakfast in the Hilton, 3 of them walked into Vienna airport, pulled Kalashnikovs from under their coats and began firing and rolling grenades at the El Al queue. When 2 Israeli security men returned fire, they turned and fled down an escalator. They made it to a car and were finally stopped in a shootout 9 miles from Vienna. 1 terrorist lay dead at the roadside. 2 others, seriously wounded, were treated in the same hospital as their victims. In a simultaneous attack at Rome airport, the carnage was even greater.
I heard it sounded like a grenade bouncing on the floor, and I look and there was a grenade and it exploded and everyone just hit the deck. And then the Italian army took over.
Then all 4 terrorists opened up with Kalashnikovs. Passengers at a coffee bar close to the El Al and TWA desks were caught in the hail of fire as security forces fought back. 15 died and 119 were injured. The Libyan news agency described the attacks as acts of heroism. The 1 terrorist who survived revealed both Syrian and Libyan connections to the Abu Nidal group. Spontaneous demonstrations on the streets show how his own people feel about Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. In 20 years, his Green Revolution has transformed Libya, giving it a standard of living that is the envy of its neighbors. But to the rest of the world, he is the prime promoter of terrorism, a man with blood on his hands. In the 70s, he gave millions to terrorists, handing out bonuses for spectacular actions like the Munich Olympic massacre. The group that seized the OPEC ministers had his special protection. Its leader was the most wanted terrorist of all time, Carlos the Jackal, alias Ramirez Sanchez, who was sheltered and funded by Gaddafi. His support for terror groups is still generous. In 1987, the seizure of the Exxon by French police revealed a cargo of arms worth $30 million bound for the Provisional IRA. This was believed to be only one of a number of shipments. Gaddafi's political opponents abroad are tracked down by hit squads equipped through the diplomatic channels of his People's Bureau. In 1984, an anti-Gaddafi demonstration outside the London Bureau resulted in the murder of a woman police officer. Ten others were wounded in the hail of shots fired by an accredited diplomat from within the embassy. Protected under international law, he was allowed to go free with the other staff, but Britain broke off diplomatic relations with Libya. Each new outrage committed by Abu Nidal's group implicated Gaddafi as its protector and supplier. Grenades used at Rome and Vienna were checked against captured equipment in Chad and identified as Libyan. For President Reagan, that was conclusive.
The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Gaddafi's backing.
Relations between the 2 countries have been bad since 1981, when the carrier USS Nimitz and the 6th Fleet conducted maneuvers off the Libyan coast. Gaddafi claimed the whole Gulf of Sirte as Libyan territorial waters, drawing what he called his line of death across the mouth of the Gulf. The Americans, recognizing only the 12-mile limit, began exercises within the Gulf. Two F-14 Tomcats of the Nimitz Black Aces squadron were patrolling round the fleet when they clashed with two Libyan Su-22s supplied by Russia. A Libyan plane fired off a missile, but they were no match for the F-14s with their sophisticated radar and weapons systems, and both were shot down. The next day, President Reagan was on board another carrier in the Pacific, visibly pleased at the attention now focused on what he called American military muscle. In March 1986, he again decided on carrier diplomacy. In the wake of Rome and Vienna, it was time for another freedom of navigation exercise in the Gulf of Sirte. Gaddafi responded in typically flamboyant style, launching ground-to-air missiles and attacking in patrol boats, but they were no match for the three American carriers facing him. They replied with air raids on the missile sites, and air-launched Harpoon missiles destroyed 4 of his new Soviet fast patrol boats. On the streets of Tripoli, angry crowds demonstrated their support, calling for suicide raids against the US fleet. For them, America was clearly the aggressor, and rather than denting Gaddafi's prestige, it made him a hero. Chillingly, he threatened to escalate the conflict all over the world. On April the 5th, he did. A bomb in a Berlin disco killed 2. 70 US servicemen were among the injured. Decoded signals from Libya to its Berlin bureau revealed the culprits. On April the 14th, the Americans conducted what they called routine NATO exercises at their British bases. But the bombs were for real. 18 F-111s, some capable of radar jamming, were preparing for a 6,000-mile journey. They were going to raid Libya. With British government consent, the American F-111s took off around 7 p.m. Out over the Atlantic, US tanker planes were waiting to refuel them. France and Spain had refused permission to overfly, adding 3,000 miles to the flight. Over the Mediterranean, they dropped low to avoid Libyan radar, arriving at 2 a.m. The 6th Fleet attacked first, A-7 bombers hitting an airfield and a barracks in Benghazi. In Tripoli, the F-111s attacked the Al Azizaya barracks, Libya's main terrorist HQ, and the port and military airport. Film of the attack was later shown to journalists.
The F-111 crew is using their attack radar to steer toward the target. The weapons system officer has found the Tripoli International Airport on the radar. Pilot makes corrections to the target. There are the bombs. And that's the impact.
16 F-111s landed back in Britain on the 15th after 13 hours in the air. One had been shot down, another landed in Spain. Equipped with laser-guided bombs, the F-111s should be totally accurate. One plane uses a laser beam to locate and illuminate the target, while a second drops its bombs which guide themselves to the laser spot. But the damage on the ground told a different story.
What is this? Is this military target? It's clear now who is the assassin. It's clear.
Wrecked buildings in the suburbs and the toll of dead or injured refuted the image of a surgically precise raid. Damage to Gaddafi's house, his sagging Bedouin tent and the death of his adopted daughter proved that they had hit some targets and that Gaddafi too had been a marked man. Despite angry world reaction, President Reagan was unrepentant.
Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
Today, Gaddafi's house is kept as a memorial to the raid, still fueling anti-American sentiment, but there has been a lessening of terrorist activity. Intelligence sources say that Abu Nidal is now trying to negotiate a return to his old base, Iraq. Pro-Gaddafi demonstrations on the streets of Damascus during his clash with America came as no surprise, for the Syrians have supported the same terrorist groups whose acts sparked the Libya raid. President Assad's rise to prominence in the complex web of Middle East politics has not been built solely on his powerful Soviet-supplied army. For years, Syria has pursued its policies through proxy forces. The Palestinian factions it harbors have been used for Syrian goals. It supported Palestinian leaders like Abu Musa and Ahmed Jabril in their attempt to wrest control of the PLO from Yasser Arafat in 1983. Its aid to the Muslim militias in the struggle for Beirut helped secure its position as the dominant force in Lebanese politics. Evidence from the surviving terrorists in the Rome and Vienna attacks revealed that Abu Nidal has an operational base in Damascus, that he had links with Syrian military intelligence, and that the attacks had been planned in a Damascus apartment. Syria, like Libya, was sponsoring terrorism. In 1986, Palestinian Nizar Hindawi planned bomb attacks in Berlin and London that were to reveal the full extent of Syrian involvement in terrorism. The first attack was on the German Arab-friendly society in West Berlin, carried out by his brother Hassi and Farouk Salameh. At his trial, Hassi revealed that on his brother's orders, he had crossed over to East Berlin on a one-day pass to collect the explosives and detonator from the Syrian embassy on Otto Grotewohlstrasse. He then smuggled the bomb into West Berlin by a circuitous route with the aid of his accomplice. When the bomb failed to explode, his brother called in a Syrian bomb expert, known to them as Abu Ahmed, who drove across from the east, repairing the bomb in minutes. This time, it went off. German police suspected a link to the La Belle disco bombing, though Hassi denied it. But Hindawi had another plan. An El Al Jumbo flying from London to Israel was to be blown out of the skies at 1:04 on April the 17th. Anne Murphy, his girlfriend, who was pregnant by him, was to be the unwitting human time bomb. On the morning of the 17th, he took her to Heathrow Airport. Hindawi had persuaded her to take a holiday in Israel, saying he would join her there and they would get married. He gave her a new overnight bag as a present. What she didn't know was that it contained a sophisticated time bomb constructed in Damascus, and that she and the other passengers had been chosen to die for a cause she knew nothing of. The airport's own security check failed to detect the device. An El Al guard who searched her bag discovered a secret compartment containing Czechoslovakian military explosives and a calculator, the trigger for the bomb activated by Hindawi that morning. Unaware the bomb had been discovered, Hindawi had returned to his central London hotel to begin his escape. It was here that he regularly met his controller, the man who had trained him in Syria, Colonel Haytham Said, Deputy Commander, Syrian Air Force Intelligence, who was also known as Abu Ahmed. Together they had finalized the plans for the aircraft's destruction. Hindawi was using a Syrian government passport in the name of Isham Shah. Occasionally he shared a room with Colonel Said, whose passport described him as a Mr. Kokash. Hearing that the bomb had been found, Hindawi went straight to the Syrian embassy. There he met the Syrian ambassador, Dr. Lufov al-Haidar. According to Hindawi's statement, the ambassador told him he had done good things and arranged for him to be taken to a safe house by 3 diplomats. The diplomats, 2 pictured here, were expelled from Britain in May that year. They disguised him while at the safe house, but the next morning, when one of them took hold of him, Hindawi panicked, thinking he would be killed, and ran off, later surrendering to the police. In his evidence, he revealed that Colonel Haytham Said had brought the bomb into the country using a diplomatic passport, which prevented a search of his bags. This had also been the case in Berlin. Like the Libyans, the Syrians were using diplomatic cover to supply their agents abroad. In a letter smuggled out of Brixton prison in May 1986, Hindawi asked his cousin to contact Abu Ahmed, also known as Haytham Said, and persuade him to arrange a deal for him. In addition to naming Colonel Said as the Damascus contact, it also referred to Israeli prisoners held by Ahmed Jabril and his PFLP-GC, and suggested Syrian influence over the hostages being held in Beirut. The letter highlighted the role of Syria's intelligence services in the shadowy terrorist world. Yet despite the Hindawi case, Colonel Said's immediate superior in Syrian Air Force intelligence was recently promoted and now is even closer to President Assad. Suicide bombings, kidnapping, hijacking, the chosen tactics of Hezbollah, the party of God. Their aim is to spread Khomeini's revolution throughout the Middle East. Their inspiration, their money and their orders come from Iran. After the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini appeared more as a divine being than a man to the Shiite Muslims who form 90% of Iran's population. His Islamic fundamentalism brought out the ancient traditions of self-sacrifice and martyrdom at the heart of the Shiite faith. Young volunteers flocked to join his jihad or holy war with Iraq, their headbands proudly proclaiming their willingness to achieve martyrdom in the Iraqi minefields. But Iraq was not the only enemy. Khomeini dreamed of an Islamic revolution throughout the Muslim world. Among the Shiite population of southern Lebanon, his call for holy war was answered. Extreme fundamentalists of Hezbollah were willing to sacrifice themselves for Islam. This Israeli ammunition convoy had no defense from a car packed with explosives and a driver blessed by a mullah and ready for martyrdom. The Israelis were not the only target. On the 23rd of October 1983, the Beirut headquarters of American and French peacekeeping forces were devastated by two separate suicide car bombs.
We figured it had to have at least 2,000 pounds of TNT. It was observed coming at a high rate of speed from the south of the building, crashed through the gate and through the guard post, and then detonated inside the lobby. There's a crater down there about 30 feet deep and about 40 feet across.
The American building collapsed, killing 241 Marines. Only a lucky few were brought out of the wreckage alive. The French building suffered a similar fate. 58 French troops died in the carnage. Both bombers had gone willingly to their deaths. They were members of Islamic Jihad, one of the extreme groups within Hezbollah. Four months later, the Americans withdrew, unwilling to sustain such losses in a country where every hand was against them. With a truck and some dynamite, Hezbollah had won another victory in Khomeini's holy war. Despite the chaos in Beirut in 1985, the airport was still operating, providing hijackers with easy access to the international network. A spate of hijackings culminated in the bizarre 17-day drama of TWA Flight 847, played out before the world's media on the tarmac of Beirut Airport. Shiite militiamen of Amal strolled on the runway, ostensibly policing the airport, yet the Hezbollah hijackers were allowed to do as they pleased. Nabi Berri, Amal's leader, negotiated for them. In return for the release of the 44 hostages, they demanded the freedom of Shiite prisoners taken by the Israelis in the Lebanon. Nabi Berri professed disapproval of Hezbollah's method, but he made no secret of his support for their cause.
Save those people, release your innocent people from your jail. This problem, it will be finished in 24 hours.
American warships appeared off the coast, suggesting a rescue attempt. But the hijackers had already prepared for that.
Captain Drake, do you have any idea what's happened to the passengers on the aircraft?
No, except we've been told that they've been taken to a safe place, that they're comfortable and being well taken care of.
Hezbollah and Amal had cooperated, taking the hostages from the plane at night. They had hidden them in the city in different locations, effectively ruling out any military solutions. With all eyes on Beirut, Hezbollah took full advantage of the publicity. At one point, the two original hijackers appeared to a tumultuous welcome from their supporters. Behind the scenes, American pressure was mounting, and the Israelis began releasing their Shiite prisoners in batches. Despite denials by all parties, it was obvious a deal had been done. Hezbollah had achieved another victory. Some of the same hijackers were in action again. In 1988, the seizure of a Kuwaiti 747 showed how much they'd learned by experience. After diverting the plane to Iran, a second team of hijackers came on board carrying heavy weapons and explosives. Throughout, they operated like a highly trained special forces squad. No one doubted their seriousness when they callously dumped the body of their first victim on the Larnaca runway. The choice of a Kuwaiti plane was no accident. Kuwait City had been an early target for Khomeini's web of terror. In 1983, a series of bombings shook the city, the work of Dawa, an Iraqi Shiite group linked to both the Khomeini regime and Hezbollah. 17 of them were imprisoned, and the Kuwaiti government refused all demands for their release. Even with Kuwaiti royal hostages, these hijackers failed to free them, and after 16 days they gave up in return for safe passage. Professional to the last, they wiped their fingerprints from the plane before leaving. The seizure of hostages has been Hezbollah's most callous and yet most profitable tactic. Governments have found it difficult to resist popular demand for negotiation with kidnappers when faced with the haunting images of the captives on video. In return for Hezbollah's prisoners in the Lebanon, Iran has received both money and weapons. The resolve of different countries was shaken when it was revealed that despite his rhetoric, the American president had himself bowed to pressure.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
The death of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 has taken some of the fervor out of the Islamic Revolution. But in Beirut, Hezbollah still holds hostages, their suffering prolonged by each new crisis in the Middle East. Freedom of movement and technological change have in many ways made the terrorists' role easier over the last 2 decades and increased the scale of destruction they can achieve. Guarding against each new innovation they introduce is a battle the security forces can never really win. The frequent use of the Czech explosive Semtex during the 80s is just one example. Without any trace elements, it passes through the standard bomb detectors. The fate of Pan Am Flight 103, which exploded, then crashed on the Scottish town of Lockerbie in 1988, was a disastrous example of the terrible power of even a small charge. In actively combating terrorism, however, a lot has been learned. The Israeli rescue of hostages from Entebbe in 1976 was an early example of what a skilled elite force can achieve. In an operation that took only 36 minutes on the ground, the crucial moment was the seizure of the room where the hostages were held, as the Israeli Chief of Staff explained.
The battle inside the building did not take more than 1 minute, something like 45 seconds, and in that time our people succeeded to kill 4 of the terrorists who were inside that room.
Most countries have now developed counter-terrorist teams, and the British Special Air Service action at the Iranian embassy in London in 1980 showed how effective they can be. After a 6-day siege and the death of 2 hostages, the SAS used listening devices in the chimneys to locate the terrorists, then abseiled from the roof, breaking into the building at different points. They hurled stun grenades into the building, then swept it to a preconceived plan to devastating effect. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. There are other ways of fighting terrorism, as the Americans showed in 1985, when they launched fighters to force down the plane carrying the Achille Lauro hijackers. It landed at a NATO base in Sicily. Delta Force commandos had flown in to seize them for trial in the USA. The Italian government asserted its right to imprison them there. It was only discovered later that Abu Abbas, the leader of the PLF, had been on board the plane and had been allowed to leave. President Reagan underlined the new American policy.
Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines sent a message to terrorists everywhere. A message: you can run, but you can't hide.
Today, as the multinational forces line up against Iraq, terrorist tactics are in use again, this time as an additional arm of warfare. Palestinians like Abu Abbas, now in Iraq, threaten to use their own special skills if it comes to war.
If America stops Iraqi civilian planes in order to check them as part of the air blockade, we will also stop American planes. If America shoots down an Iraqi airliner, we will bring down an American airliner.
And Saddam Hussein is ready to use his civilian hostages as a human shield if war breaks out. Eyes of the world, an image so important to the hijackers that they warned the cameraman to wait for it. 20 years on, the association of that cause with terrorism still impedes every attempt at a peaceful solution. It was just one instance in a cycle of violence that in the last 20 years has become increasingly random, creating a climate of fear throughout much of the world. The security forces are rarely able to predict the source or direction of the next attack, and as terrorists become more sophisticated, opportunities for successful intervention occur only rarely. For much of its history, those resorting to terrorism fell into two main categories: groups ostensibly fighting for a nationalist or separatist cause, like the Provisional IRA and ETA in Spain, among many others, and the left-wing or anarchist groups hoping to provoke a revolution like the Red Brigade and the Baader-Meinhof gang. Countries have adopted the tactics of the terrorist. State-sponsored terrorism is the latest evolution of a phenomenon that has its roots in post-war Palestine. Israel is a country preoccupied with terrorism, its people constantly on guard against attacks from within and without. Terrorism here is even older than the state itself, and the first examples of it were not Arab but Jewish. In 1946, the King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British-mandated government of Palestine. A bomb planted by a Jewish terrorist group, the Irgun Zavai Leumi, killed 88 people. The Irgun member who planned the attack was Menachem Begin, later Prime Minister of Israel. Another member wanted by the British police was Yitzhak Yezhenitsky, now Yitzhak Shamir, the present Prime Minister. It was part of a campaign to drive the British out of Palestine. And it worked. In the wake of the Nazi Holocaust, the creation of a Jewish homeland had strong backing, and the UN decided on partition. In the Arab-Israeli war that followed, the Irgun and Stern gangs conducted a campaign of terror to drive out the Arab population. A massacre at Deir Yassin accelerated the flight of the Arabs. 700,000 Palestinians left their lands for refugee camps in the West Banks and neighboring countries. The long and bloody exile of the Palestinians had begun. When Yasser Arafat attended the United Nations in 1974 as the leader of the PLO, he came with an olive branch and a gun, asking the world not to let the olive branch slip from his hand. Yet while he may have held the olive branch, his was not the only gun among the Palestinians. For the PLO is an umbrella organization within which a number of different groups operate. Each of them have different political programs, and tactically they have all learnt from each other, through direct contact or by example. The IRA's car bomb was readily adopted into the Middle East, and faced with stronger defences, it evolved into the suicide bomb. Encountering a similar problem, the IRA introduced proxy bombing, forcing men to become suicide bombers while their families are held hostage. Just as the tactics have evolved, so too has the nature of terrorism. During the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, the world watched a superpower held to ransom. The threat to the lives of its citizens left America powerless. Its failed rescue attempt only added to its humiliation, exacerbating the plight of the hostages. The events of those 444 days in Iran highlighted a third mutation of terrorism. Dawson's Field, Jordan, 1970, a final gesture to fix the cause of Palestinian liberation in the